Hello everybody, welcome to Chapter 15 of Price Analysis, a fundamental approach to the study of commodity markets. In this chapter we're going to change pace a little bit from talking about crops and grain and oilseed markets and their futures prices to talking about livestock markets, particularly cattle markets, beef cattle markets. As with any commodity, the production cycle is going to be really informative into the kind of things we should be paying attention to when we're trying to do price analysis in cattle markets. So we're going to begin the chapter by talking about a little bit of the basics of how beef cattle production works. So the first stage of the industry is called the cow-calf operators. And these are ranchers whose business is owning mother cows who have a calf every year. And they raise the calf from being a tiny baby to being a little bit bigger. We'll talk about the details in a minute, but being a little bit bigger, and that's then they sell the calf at that point, and that's how they make their livelihood. The second stage in beef cattle production are backgrounder operators. So these are individuals who own medium to large feedlot, and they buy calves that are basically coming off of a cow-calf operation and into the backgrounders operation, and their business is taking those light calves and making them bigger. And then after the calves have spent some time with the backgrounder, they'll go on to a finisher, which is usually a large feedlot, and the business of the finisher is to take a fairly heavy calf and feed it grain until it's finishing or slaughter weight. So those three stages of the production process are usually managed by different firms. So the cow-calf operators are usually different people than the backgrounder, and that's usually a different business entity than the finisher or the feedlot. There are cases of more vertically integrated beef cattle operations, but that's not really the industry standard. So let's talk about each stage in a little bit more detail to give us a feel about how this market works. So the cow-calf operation. In a typical cow-calf operation, the producer has a herd of breeding cows, and each of those cows is expected to have one calf per year, and the sale of those calves will be how the cow-calf operation makes money. So the cow-calf producer usually owns or leases land for summer pasture and winter pasture and hay production. So, if you don't know, hay is the dried forage that's fed to cattle during the winter months when the grass is dormant. There is some amount of cow-calf operators purchasing hay on the open market, particularly when there's a short crop of hay, but it's usually more cost-effective for a farmer or a beef cattle rancher to put up their own hay, so that's typically what's done. So what are the basics of the production calendar for a cow-calf producer? So the rest of what I'm going to talk about borrows heavily from the beef production calendar that the University of Nebraska Extension puts out. And so the way the timing works is most cow-calf producers generally run their operations as a spring calving production system. So this means that they time the calving so that the calves are born in February or March, and they can be weaned and marketed in the fall of the same year. So during February, March, and April, the calves are born, and male calves are called bull calves, and females are called heifer calves. Newborn calves weigh about 50 to 80 pounds, and at this time, a producer is going to make a decision about if any of the cows are getting old and need to be culled from the herd. Then they'll kind of pick out the best heifer calf to replace one of the breeding cows, and the breeding cow will go to market and be replaced by the younger calf. So during February, March, and April, the cows are on winter pasture, and they're usually being fed supplements of hay because there's not enough grass production on the winter pasture during those colder months. When May rolls around, it's a good time of year for cows and calves because they usually get moved to their summer pasture in May or early June. And the exact date kind of depends on the weather because they get moved to summer pasture once there's enough grass out there to sustain the herd. And usually before you take the cows and calves to grass, you'll work the calves, and that usually means that bull calves get castrated. And after a bull calf has been castrated, then it's called a steer. So during June, July, and August, the summer months, the cows and the calves are out on summer pasture, and they're pretty low maintenance at this point. The ranchers will go visit them every so often to make sure that they're all there and that there's no problems with the fence and that their water is still plentiful in the ponds or streams that run through the pasture. But they pretty much just hang out there by themselves and have a nice time eating the summer grass. It's at this time that bulls are placed with the cows in order to breed all of the cows in the breeding herd. And the market for bulls is under a totally different pricing model than the beef cattle prices that we'll talk about later in this chapter. Because a rancher is going to buy one bull to breed their whole herd, the most cost-efficient way to get better genetics into your herd is to invest into one bull rather than many cows. So the bull market is definitely not a commodity, and ranches that specialize in raising high-quality bulls will fetch very premium prices for their bulls, and they'll often, in fact, sell insemination services. So you can buy bull semen from a ranch that specializes in raising bulls. So some producers, especially producers who raise both beef cattle and also raise corn and soybeans, they'll place creep feeders out in the herd with summer grass. And creep feeders are nice because they kind of have these gates on them that the small calves can get through and get to the grain, and that helps the calves get bigger more quickly when they're out on summer grass. But the mature mother cows, they don't need grain. They do spectacularly well eating the grass, and the grain is expensive. So the creep feeders are designed to keep out So in case you're having a hard time visualizing this, it looks something like this. There's usually a compartment where you can put grain in there, so corn and soybean meal or whatever you're feeding. And these gates keep out the big cows, but the calves can just run in between those grates, and then helps them get big faster. Once they get too big, then they can't get inside anymore. So I mentioned that the cows and calves are pretty low maintenance during the summer months because they're happily out on summer pasture. But the ranchers during this time are usually busy putting up hay for the winter. So the hay becomes mature in this time of year. And that's when it gets cut and dried and baled and then put into storage until winter. So when September rolls around, it's getting to the end of the summer season. So during this time, if it's a dry year, the farmers and ranchers will be actively monitoring the levels of grass on the pastures. And if it's a drought situation, they may have to bring the cows and calves home to winter pasture early if they run out of grass, or perhaps start supplementing them with hay in the summer pasture if the grass is short. But it's usually more convenient for the rancher to feed hay when they're on winter pasture because it tends to be close to where they're stockpiling the hay. But it just depends on the individual situation. The other thing that happens in September is that all of the cows should be bred, and so oftentimes producers will do what's called a preg check, and that means a vet comes out and determines if the cow has been successfully bred. And any of the cows that are open, which means not pregnant, the rancher will decide whether they're going to cull them immediately or if they'll keep them around and give them one more chance to get bred. Now, of course, the whole business is the cows are supposed to get pregnant, have a baby, so that the rancher can sell the calf. And cows that are open are very expensive. So if they don't breed in one or two chances, then the rancher is going to sell them in the cattle market. All right, so by October, the herd will usually have exhausted the summer forage in the summer pasture, and so they're usually brought home to winter pasture. And this is around the same time that the rancher is going to wean the calves that were born in the last early spring. And they usually weigh 500 to 600 pounds after they've spent a summer eating grass and mother's milk. So once the calves are weaned, the rancher can either keep them around for a little while and start feeding them grain to get them fatter, or they can be sold to a backgrounder. And the decision that a rancher makes on when to sell will obviously depend on what the current market price is and what the price differential is for light calves versus heavy calves. If they can get a premium for heavy calves and keep them around and feed them cheap grain, then they'll probably keep them around a while. But if grain prices are high, then maybe they'll just send them to market immediately after the calves have been weaned. So next, here are a couple of links from Oklahoma State about the weaning. One is about one technique for the weaning process, and the other is a discussion about prospects for forage during a dry period. So what happens during November, December, and January? So the rancher of the cow-calf operation, they're just going to keep feeding hay to the mother cows and feeding grain to the newly weaned calves until they decide to send them to market. And remember, the cows that they're feeding are bred, and so they're getting close to being ready to have babies by the time January rolls around. So the rancher may be going out and they'll be with the herd every day as they're feeding them hay. They're going to be watching for whether any of the mother calves have started to, if any of the mother cows have started to have calves, and keeping an eye on them to see if they're going to need any help when they're giving birth. All right, so let's move on to talking about the next part of the beef cattle business, and that's going to be the backgrounder or the stocker. So the backgrounder is in business of buying light calves, so approximately 500 to 600 pounds. These are going to be the calves that have been newly weaned after coming off of summer pasture. And so their business is going to be buying a bunch of them and feeding them grain until they've gained at least 100 pounds or more. So there is some fluidity in this business. Some cow-calf producers have a set of pens where they can feed their own calves or even buy some more calves that they can feed out as a backgrounder themselves. And there are other producers who are strictly in the business of feeding the light calves as a backgrounder. And so they don't have a lot of land, but they have a good set of pens, and maybe they have some land where they're able to put up hay, or maybe they're buying hay on the open market. So a backgrounder who's going to go and purchase calves at auction is going to be thinking about the differential between different calves' weight and the different genders of the calf. So it turns out that bull calves put on weight faster than heifer calves. So bull calves tend to be a little higher priced than heifer calves because they gain weight more efficiently. And the backgrounder's business is all about how efficiently they can put weight on these calves. And also, smaller and younger calves gain weight faster than heavier and older calves. So the prices of smaller calves tend to be higher per pound than the price of heavier calves. So let's take a look at this USDA market news report. See this in action. So these are prices reported to the USDA from Dodge City, Kansas, and this was the most recent report from last Friday, November 3rd. So this is some information about the quantity that was offered for sale. Down here are some prices. Oh, so here we have feeder steers and feeder heifers. So notice that they break out the prices by gender, and then they also break them out by size. So medium and large, you're going to see they saw 350 to 400 pound calves. Those are quite light, trading for $195 to $202, and those are dollars per hundredweight. And next weight category is 400 to 450 pounds. Those were trading for $195 to $201, $450 to $500, $196 to $197. Let's skip down to some heavier weights. Here, yeah, $650 to $700. They're trading. They were offered for $157 to $165. And so you can see these really light calves, they were going for a premium because they're going to be putting on weight really fast. And when you get down here to this heavier category, they're discounted by as much as $40 compared to the light calves. And that's because once the calves reach this 650 to 700 range, they're not going to be gaining weight as fast as these light calves are. Now let's compare similarly sized steers and heifers. So here, I'm going to try to find a 650 to 700. Here's 600 to 650 pounds. Those are offered for 153 to 157. And a similarly sized steer is going to be offered for 157 to 165. So you see the price of the steer is higher than the price of the heifer.